women, soon to be married women, are concerned that the new voter ID requirements may inhibit their access to the polls. What assurances can you give women voters in America to ease their concerns?
Sure. Well, the SAVE Act, as you mentioned, was passed by the House yesterday. This is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. I believe I'm getting that correct. And this act is a common sense measure. It would require proof of citizenship for voting in our elections. The Democrats have been fear-mongering about this bill, have been saying that married women, if their name has changed, they didn't change it on their identification, would not be able to vote. That is complete fallacy. There are outlined in the bill about how to avoid that.
And my people told me about 4 weeks ago, I was saying, no, I want to protect the people. I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. I said, well.
The president very much supports a common sense solution to ensuring that only citizens can.
Okay, so the MAGA movement just crossed a line that has women across America absolutely furious right now. And we're talking about something that goes way beyond normal political disagreements. This isn't just another culture war skirmish or some Twitter beef that'll blow over in a week. What we're seeing unfold in real time is a coordinated nationwide assault on women's rights, women's autonomy, and women's basic dignity, all stemming from Trump's latest policy move, and the backlash is unlike anything we've seen in modern American politics. Republican women are turning on their own party, moderate conservatives are in full panic mode, and Democratic strategists are watching this unfold, knowing that Trump and his MAGA loyalists just handed them the biggest political gift imaginable heading into 2026. This is a constitutional crisis, a human rights disaster, and a political catastrophe all wrapped into one. And the implications for American democracy, for women's safety, for the upcoming midterms, and for Trump's entire second-term agenda are absolutely massive. Now, look, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the sanitized version, the both sides narrative, the corporate-approved take that doesn't really tell you what's happening on the ground. That's why we built Politic Insane, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this, because we need to hear from you about what's happening in your state, in your community, in your life. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Just days ago, Trump signed an executive order that fundamentally redefines federal protections for reproductive health care access. And the language in this order is so broad, so vague, and so deliberately weaponized that it effectively gives states and private citizens the legal cover to surveil, harass, prosecute, and punish women who seek abortion, care, contraception, or even certain forms of prenatal care that MAGA activists have decided to target. The order doesn't just roll back existing protections, it actively encourages enforcement mechanisms that turn neighbors into informants, doctors into criminals, and women into suspects. Within hours of Trump signing this order, MAGA-controlled state legislatures in Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, Missouri, and at least 6 other states announced their fast-tracking legislation that would implement some of the most extreme enforcement provisions imaginable. We're talking about criminal penalties for women who travel out of state for care, civil lawsuits against anyone who helps facilitate abortion access, mandatory reporting requirements for healthcare providers that essentially create surveillance databases of pregnant women, and bounty systems that pay private citizens to sue anyone suspected of violating these new restrictions. And this is where things start to unravel. The White House isn't backing down, they're doubling down. Trump went on Truth Social and called this order the most pro-life action any president has ever taken, and his MAGA base went absolutely insane, with celebration, flooding social media with threats, doxing campaigns, and harassment targeting women's health clinics, reproductive rights advocates, and even individual women who've spoken publicly about their healthcare decisions. We're seeing coordinated brigades descending on women's rights organizations, rape crisis centers, and Planned Parenthood facilities across the country. Women are reporting stalking, threatening phone calls, vandalism of their property, and in some cases, outright physical intimidation. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening because Trump's executive order gave these extremists exactly what they wanted, official presidential endorsement of their crusade, and now they feel empowered to take the law into their own hands. But it gets worse. Legal experts are already saying this executive order is on extremely shaky constitutional ground, but here's the terrifying part. It doesn't matter if it's unconstitutional, if the enforcement happens before the courts can stop it. Women are already being denied care right now. Doctors are already refusing to provide legal medical treatments right now because they're terrified of prosecution. Pharmacies are already withholding FDA-approved medications right now because they don't want to be the next target of a MAGA lawsuit. The damage is happening in real time, and even if federal courts eventually strike down this order, the harm will already be done. Women will have been forced to carry non-viable pregnancies. Women will have suffered medical emergencies that could have been prevented. Women will have been prosecuted, sued, harassed, and traumatized, all because Trump decided to throw red meat to his base with an executive order that treats women's bodies as property of the state. Now, here's where this becomes a lot bigger than it looks. To understand why this is a full-blown constitutional crisis and not just another policy fight, you need to understand what legal framework Trump is trying to dismantle and how the MAGA movement is exploiting every possible loophole to make that happen. The constitutional right to privacy, established through cases like Griswold and reinforced for decades until Dobbs, created a legal shield that protected individuals from government intrusion into their most intimate healthcare decisions. Even after Dobbs overturned Roe, there were still federal protections in place, statutory protections, regulatory protections, and constitutional protections related to interstate commerce, equal protection, and due process that limited how far states could go in restricting reproductive health care. Trump's executive order tries to bypass all of that by redefining what counts as abortion, what counts as interstate commerce, and what counts as legitimate health care, and in doing so, it gives states permission to ignore federal protections that have been settled law for generations. The order specifically targets something called the aiding and abetting framework, which is legal language that allows states to prosecute not just the person receiving care, but anyone who helps them access that care. This means if you drive your sister to a clinic in another state, you could be sued. If you donate money to an organization that provides reproductive health care, you could be sued. Like if you share information online about how to access legal abortion services, you could be sued. This isn't hypothetical. These provisions are already being written into state laws right now as we speak. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced yesterday that his office is preparing lawsuits against out-of-state providers who offer telehealth abortion services to Texas residents, and he's using Trump's executive order as the legal justification. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis just signed emergency legislation that makes it a felony to assist anyone under the age of 18 in obtaining abortion care without parental consent, even in cases of rape or incest. And again, he's citing Trump's order as giving him the authority to do this. This law wasn't designed for this purpose. The Commerce Clause, which Trump's order tries to reinterpret and was created to regulate trade between states and prevent economic protectionism, it was not designed to be a weapon that allows states to control what women do with their own bodies when they cross state lines. The 10th Amendment, which Trump keeps invoking to justify states' rights on this issue, was never intended to override fundamental individual liberties protected by the 14th Amendment. The whole architecture of American constitutional law is built on the principle that individual rights constrain government power, not the other way around. And what Trump is doing with this executive order is flipping that framework entirely. He's saying states have the power to surveil, control, and punish women for private medical decisions. And he's saying the federal government not only won't protect those women, but will actively help states enforce these restrictions. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here are staggering, and they cut across every dimension of American political, social, and institutional life. First, understand that the immediate impact on women's health is catastrophic, and it's happening right now in emergency rooms, doctors' offices, and pharmacies across America. Women with ectopic pregnancies are being denied life-saving care because hospitals are terrified that treating an ectopic pregnancy might be classified as abortion under these new state laws. Women experiencing miscarriages are being forced to wait until they're actively dying before doctors will intervene because the legal language is so vague that physicians can't determine what's legally permissible. Women with chronic health conditions who need medications that are also used in abortion care are being told by pharmacies that they can no longer fill those prescriptions because the pharmacy doesn't want to risk liability. This isn't a theoretical policy debate anymore. This is women bleeding out in parking lots, women developing sepsis from incomplete miscarriages, women being forced to carry fetuses with fatal abnormalities to term because their state has decided that's what God wants. Second, this is redefining the relationship between individuals and the state in ways that should terrify anyone who cares about civil liberties, regardless of where you stand on abortion. When a government claims the authority to monitor your private medical decisions, to track your movements across state lines, to prosecute you for seeking legal health care in another jurisdiction, and to deputize private citizens to sue you for exercising your constitutional rights, that government has crossed into authoritarian territory. This isn't about pro-life versus pro-choice anymore. This is about whether the state has the power to treat women as perpetual suspects who must prove their innocence to the government before accessing basic health care. The surveillance infrastructure that MAGA states are building right now, mandatory reporting by healthcare providers, data sharing agreements between states, criminal investigations triggered by pregnancy outcomes, this is the kind of apparatus that once built never goes away. Today it's used to prosecute women for abortion. Tomorrow it's used to prosecute people for any healthcare decision the government doesn't like, any travel the government wants to monitor, any association the government wants to control. Third, the political ramifications are absolutely massive, and Republicans are starting to realize they may have just committed political suicide heading into 2026. Every single poll conducted since Trump signed this order shows women voters, including Republican women, turning against the GOP in numbers that should terrify Republican strategists. We're talking about double-digit swings in suburban districts, college-educated women abandoning the party entirely, and even conservative women in rural areas saying they can't support a party that treats them like criminals for seeking health care. Democratic candidates are already cutting ads featuring women who've been denied care under these new restrictions. Republican moderates in swing districts are trying to distance themselves from Trump's order, and the MAGA base is attacking those moderates as traitors, which is creating a civil war within the Republican Party that could hand Democrats everything they need to retake the House, expand their Senate majority, and set up a complete repudiation of Trumpism in 2028. But here's the problem Republicans face. They can't back down now without enraging the MAGA base that controls their primaries. Trump has made this the centerpiece of his second-term agenda. He's told his supporters that this is the fight that defines his presidency, and if Republican politicians try to moderate their position now, they'll be primaried by MAGA challengers who will call them baby killers and rhinos. But if they stick with Trump's position, they're going to get destroyed in general elections by voters who are watching in real time as women are denied life-saving care, as families are torn apart by these enforcement mechanisms, and as basic constitutional rights are shredded in the name of ideological purity. Republican operatives are privately saying, this is the worst political position they've been in since the government shutdown of 2013, and unlike that crisis, which was about abstract budget numbers, this one is about women's bodies, women's lives, and women's freedom, which makes it infinitely more visceral and personal for voters. Fourth, the institutional response has been fierce and it's accelerating. Within 24 hours of Trump signing this order, attorneys general from 17 states filed a federal lawsuit challenging its constitutionality. Medical associations representing hundreds of thousands of doctors issued statements condemning the order as a threat to patient care and physician autonomy. Major corporations, including several Fortune 500 companies, announced they would cover travel and legal expenses for employees who need to access reproductive health care in other states, which is a direct rebuke to Trump's policy and a signal that the business community is not on board with this agenda. International human rights organizations are issuing statements comparing what's happening in America to repressive regimes that monitor and control women's bodies. And that comparison, while inflammatory, is not actually inaccurate, given the surveillance and enforcement mechanisms that MAGA states are implementing. The court fight is going to be brutal, and it's going to move fast. Federal judges have already issued temporary restraining orders, blocking enforcement of some state laws that were passed in response to Trump's order, and there's a very real possibility that this ends up at the Supreme Court within months, not years. But here's the wild card. Even this Supreme Court, as conservative as it is, may have serious problems with the surveillance and enforcement mechanisms that Trump's order enables. Chief Justice Roberts has historically been concerned about the court's institutional legitimacy, and signing off on a framework that allows states to prosecute women for crossing state lines to access legal health care could be a bridge too far even for him. Justice Barrett, who wrote separately in Dobbs to emphasize that the decision was about returning the issue to the states and not about authorizing state control over women's private lives, might also balk at the kind of enforcement regime that MAGA states are building. And this doesn't mean the court will strike down Trump's order. Conservative justices are very good at finding narrow grounds to uphold policies they agree with ideologically, but it does mean there's institutional resistance even within the conservative legal establishment to the most extreme implications of what Trump is doing. Fifth, the international dimension is significant, and it's damaging America's credibility on human rights in ways that will take years to repair. When the United States lectures other countries about women's rights, about freedom, about individual liberty, and then implements policies that treat women as state property, that undercuts every single foreign policy argument America tries to make. European allies are watching this with horror. Women's rights organizations around the world are pointing to America as an example of democratic backsliding, and authoritarian regimes are using Trump's policies as proof that American lectures about human rights are hypocritical nonsense. China is already running propaganda highlighting America's treatment of women. Russia is amplifying stories about women being denied care in red states, and America's soft power, its ability to influence global norms through moral leadership, is evaporating in real time. This matters because when America loses credibility on human rights, it makes it harder to build coalitions, harder to pressure adversaries, and harder to defend democratic values in international forums. Sixth, we need to talk about what this means for the next generation of women growing up in America right now. Young women are watching as their mothers, their sisters, their friends are denied basic health care, and they're learning that their bodies don't belong to them, they belong to the state. They're learning that their government views them as suspects first and citizens second. They're learning that their constitutional rights can be taken away whenever a president decides to sign an executive order. This is shaping political consciousness in ways that will define voting patterns for the next 30 years. Generation Z women are already the most progressive cohort on reproductive rights, and watching Trump do this, watching MAGA loyalists celebrate it, watching women suffer because of it, is going to create a generation of voters who will never, ever vote Republican. The GOP is creating its own demographic nightmare, and unlike previous demographic challenges the party has faced, this one is entirely self-inflicted and completely avoidable. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this story is far from over and the variables in play are enormous. In the immediate term, we're going to see an explosion of litigation. Lawsuits challenging Trump's executive order on constitutional grounds, lawsuits challenging state laws passed in response to the order, lawsuits filed by women who've been denied care, lawsuits filed by doctors who've been threatened with prosecution. The federal courts are going to be absolutely flooded with reproductive rights cases, and depending on how quickly these cases move and which judges are assigned to hear them, we could see conflicting rulings that create even more chaos. Some federal judges will issue nationwide injunctions blocking enforcement of Trump's order. Other judges will uphold it, and we'll end up with a patchwork where the law depends entirely on which federal circuit you happen to live in. In the medium term, we're going to see enforcement actions that test just how far MAGA states are willing to go. Will Texas actually try to prosecute a woman who traveled to New Mexico for an abortion? Will Florida actually enforce its bounty system and allow private citizens to collect financial rewards for reporting their neighbors? Will Missouri actually create a pregnancy registry that tracks every woman of reproductive age? These questions sound dystopian, but they're not hypothetical. These are provisions that exist in state laws right now, and we're about to find out whether Republican governors and attorneys general have the political will to enforce them. If they do enforce them, we're going to see criminal trials. We're going to see women testifying about their medical trauma in courtrooms, and we're going to see a level of human suffering that will dominate news coverage for months, which brings us back to the political calculation. Republicans will own all of that suffering. In the longer term, this is going to reshape American federalism in fundamental ways. If states can control what their residents do when they travel to other states, if states can prosecute people for accessing legal services in other jurisdictions, if states can create enforcement mechanisms that turn private citizens into bounty hunters, then the whole concept of a unified nation starts to break down. We'll effectively have two Americas, one where women have rights and one where they don't, one where you can access health care and one where seeking that health care makes you a criminal. This isn't sustainable. Something has to give. Either federal protections get reinstated through legislation or court rulings, or we end up with a country that's barely holding together because half the population lives under completely different legal regimes than the other half. Keep your eyes on these specific developments over the next few weeks because they're going to tell us where this is headed. Watch what happens in the federal courts, particularly in the Fifth Circuit, which covers Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and which has been the most friendly to conservative legal arguments. If the Fifth Circuit upholds Trump's order and the enforcement mechanisms that flow from it were on a fast track to the Supreme Court, watch what happens in Republican-controlled state legislatures as they try to implement the most extreme provisions of their new laws. If we start seeing actual prosecutions of women, actual bounty payments to informants, actual doctors going to prison, the political backlash will be instantaneous and devastating. Watch what happens in special elections and early primaries for 2026 because those are the first real tests of voter sentiment, and if Democrats are winning in districts that should be safe Republican territory, that's your signal that Trump and MAGA loyalists have fundamentally miscalculated. Watch what corporate America does because if major employers start relocating operations out of states with extreme enforcement regimes, that creates economic pressure that Republican governors can't ignore. Watch what happens internationally, particularly whether European allies start treating American reproductive rights policies as a human rights issue that affects diplomatic relations. And watch what Trump does because he's shown throughout his career that he'll throw anyone under the bus if the politics turn against him. And there's a very real possibility that if this becomes a political disaster for Republicans, Trump will try to blame governors, blame Congress, blame the courts, blame anyone except himself, and that could fracture the MAGA movement even further. So here's the bottom line. Trump and his MAGA loyalists just declared war on women, and they did it in the most extreme, most invasive, and most constitutionally suspect way possible. They're not just trying to restrict abortion access. They're building a surveillance and enforcement apparatus that treats women as perpetual suspects, that deputizes private citizens to police their neighbors, and that criminalizes basic healthcare decisions. The backlash is massive, it's growing, and it's going to define American politics for years to come. Women are furious, moderate Republicans are panicking, Democratic strategists are salivating at the political opportunities, and the courts are going to be tied up in litigation for the foreseeable future. This is a constitutional crisis because it fundamentally redefines the relationship between individuals and the state. This is a human rights disaster because women are being denied life-saving care right now. Yeah, this is a political catastrophe because Republicans just alienated the largest voting bloc in the country, heading into a midterm election. And this is a historical inflection point because the decisions made right now about whether America treats women as full citizens with constitutional rights or as state property subject to government control will define what kind of country we are for generations. The fight over this is going to be brutal, it's going to be personal, and it's going to determine whether American democracy can survive a president who's willing to shred constitutional protections to appease his most extreme supporters. Women across America are organizing right now. They're mobilizing. They're preparing to fight back through the courts, through the ballot box, through direct action, and through every means available in a democratic system. The MAGA movement thinks they've won some kind of victory here, but what they've actually done is wake up a political force that's going to haunt the Republican Party for decades. This story is far from over. The legal battles are just beginning, the political consequences are still unfolding, and the human cost of Trump's latest move is going to be measured in women's lives, women's health, and women's freedom. Keep watching, keep paying attention, and keep fighting, because what happens next will determine what kind of country we become.